Alrighty, welcome everybody. Hope you're enjoying your day so far and having a good time. This is the Chain Abstraction State of the Union. I wanted to take this time to do a little bit of a retrospective because it's been about like 18 months since we first started talking about chain abstraction. And we haven't really stopped to think as much about where this space is at, what we've accomplished so far. There's actually a lot to celebrate, a lot that has happened, and we haven't really talked about it. And then beyond that, there's also a lot of open questions around what comes next, right? Everybody is getting to this point where we're starting to see products go live. Chain abstraction is becoming more of a tangible thing, less of a theoretical outcome and more something where we will start seeing more and more applications being chain abstracted soon. So what are the next set of problems to solve when that happens? All right. Oh, it's on.
Okay, hold on, good.
Okay, cool. It's working now. Awesome. Cool. All right. As I mentioned, it's been about 18 months since we first kicked off chain abstraction as a concept. 18 months ago, we as Connext, so basically what Everclear was formerly known as, first started thinking about chain abstraction because there was this key problem that we saw in the space where there were more and more applications that were building in their own siloed ecosystems without really thinking about how to onboard their users from other places. And what we realized was that this problem wasn't really a problem that we could solve. I mentioned this at the last abstract where we kind of faked it because we realized that there wasn't really a way for us to go and solve a bunch of wallet-related concerns, a bunch of RPC and chain-related concerns, and a bunch of intent and bridging related concerns. And so instead we doubled down on the thing that we were good at, which was being an intent-based bridge. And we said that we theoretically solved all of these other problems to see what would happen in the market, to see if people would actually rally around this idea, this vision. We actually made just a very basic visual POC of what it could look like, this vision of what it could look like to deposit into Aave from any chain. And it was super exciting to see the way that the space kind of took off because pretty quickly afterwards, everyone started talking about this idea of let's allow people to deposit into my application from any chain, right? There was an interesting sequence of events, and by the way, I really tried to fill this timeline as much as I could, but there's so much. There are so many new projects that are being announced every single day. It's been extraordinarily difficult to keep up with all the updates in this space, but you can see that over the course of the next year, more and more projects started to think deeply about how they could fit into this picture, into this shared vision. And so you had Uniswap X that kind of announced being a totally abstracted cross-chain DEX in July of 2023, or Blabs, Synapse RFQ, and Router Nitro pivoting into intents, and over time, more and more, just about every single bridge pivoting into intents as well. And then you had this big shift when Near announced chain abstraction in January of 2024, which then kicked off this series, this wave of innovation. Cake framework from One Balance, a bunch of really interesting conversations, new EIPs, things like that. And this is matched by a bunch of changes that we saw in metrics. So this is a graph of the share of voice of chain abstraction as a term on Twitter over the course of the last year. You can see that there's just been this incredible growth. We're growing consistently at about 20% month over month, which is in startup terms really great consistent growth. And this doesn't really seem to show any signs of stopping. A lot of this is due to people in this room, right? People who are actively battling it out on Twitter every day. Shout out to Tabasco, for instance, who is one of the primary people who's talking about chain abstraction day in and day out. And really helping to kind of educate this ecosystem about this concept. And you're seeing this in a lot of the more tangible metrics as well. So this is a graph of intent-based volume in the last 90 days. Unfortunately, I was not able to get data over the course of last year, but you can see how intent-based bridge volume is starting to trend upwards. There's more and more bridges that are launching, more and more bridges are getting added to this site. The source for this is intent.markets, which you should check out if you can. But as more and more projects get added to this, you will start to see that more and more of the flows that move between chains will move through intent-based systems, through solvers. And you're seeing this change in solvers as well. One of the big things that we talked about last year when we first started introducing Everclear was, or I guess earlier, what year is it? Earlier this year, when we first started introducing Everclear was that the solver ecosystem was extremely centralized, right? There was a research post that came out by LeFi earlier this year talking about how the vast majority of intent-based volume was flowing through like 2 to 3 solvers. It was Wintermute and a couple, like really 1 or 2 others that were handling almost all of the cross-chain liquidity. And that is no longer the case. This is super, super interesting to see. There is now 6 pages of 10 solvers. I went through and actually scoured this. Approximately 35 of those solvers are people that are reasonably active, even if they are still operating at relatively smaller scales. And so that's a growing ecosystem, right? 35 solvers is no longer the like centralized worst case scenario we were thinking about. We're now starting to see more competition, and that's a really, really positive outcome. And then lastly, this is something that we kind of expected, right? We had hypothesized that this space will grow to thousands of rollups, and we are well on our way. There are over 100 rollups live today. Some of them are still quite small, but there are over 100 rollups live, and 87 more that are in the pipeline that have been announced. I'm sure that there are many, many more that have not been announced. The RAS providers, folks like Gelato, folks like Caldera, Conduit, are extraordinarily active. I've been talking to them about how they are just building, their pipeline is filling up behind them because they're seeing a huge amount of demand from Web 2 organizations, traditional finance, traditional technology, that are interested in using this tech to actually build new types of crypto use cases. This is exactly the kind of thing that we've wanted to do for like almost a decade now in this space. This is all incredibly bullish. And a big part of this is really just the fact that we have this amazing ecosystem that is being built on top of this like chain abstraction vision, right? There are now over 80 projects building chain abstraction. That's kind of wild. A year and a half ago, there was nobody, right? The fact that you have this many organizations betting this much money, this many VCs betting this much money, this much time, this much of everyone's lives on building this outcome is a testament to the fact that everybody is coalescing around this idea that this is the right outcome for this space. One of the really awesome things that's come out of this is that we are sort of figuring out what this space looks like, basically who is solving what problems, what segments exist in this market. We kind of saw this, people sort of self-selected into different market segments here. There's still some back and forth on figuring out how best to like organize this. Should orchestration and wallet abstraction kind of be part of the same like permissioning category? Should they be 2 separate things? Should we more strictly like delineate, order flow auctions from applications that are the sources of order flow or not? Like, should applications be running their own auctions and be their own intent originators? Should solving and clearing be like part of the same segment? Is there like more solver related things here that we're not thinking about? However, in general, with what exists today, we're starting to see things play out so that there are some delineations between who each like segment of the market is targeting, right? You have a group of people that are targeting wallets and end users associated with permissioning. So to giving permission, having users give permissions to intent protocols or to applications to use their balances. Then underneath that, you have some set of applications or protocols that are responsible for going and broadcasting a user's intent, a user's desire to a market of solvers, right? So that's the very specific problem that they're solving. Beneath that, of course, you have solvers that are actually doing the process of filling these transactions. Everclear, which is trying to solve this very specific problem for like back-end liquidity and rebalancing for solvers. And then beneath that, settlement, right? Interacting with the underlying chain, making sure that things are actually reflected on chain when this end-to-end flow completes. And then in addition to that, and this is something that we actually talked about pretty early on as part of designing, of kind of discussing what chain abstraction should look like, is an ecosystem of open standards. There's a lot of really awesome innovation that's been happening here recently, especially around account abstraction. So 4337, 7702, 7715, and 7755, the soup of numbers. I'll be totally honest, there are so many account abstraction EIPs, it is super hard to keep on top of them. I would love for somebody to make an EILI 5 of like timeline of all of them. But for the time being, I'm kind of bundling all of these together as a series of EIPs, of standards that aim to try to make it easy for users to be able to originate intents from within their own EOAs acting as smart accounts, right? Beneath that, between the kind of like order flow auction and like solver level, you have solver level EIPs. The really big one here is EIP 7683, which was proposed by Across and Uniswap. And this allows solvers to have a unified interface for how they interact with intent protocols. Basically, you don't have to go and run different infrastructure as a solver for each protocol you integrate, which would be crazy, right? Like if you had to run a different stack for Across, a different stack for Uniswap, a different stack for router, different stack for DLN, you would really have this incredibly fragmented solver ecosystem, which is already difficult when you only have 35 active players, right? And so this allows for those 35 active players to go and run one stack of infrastructure, to go optimize the shit out of that stack of infrastructure, and then just plug into any order flow source. This also decentralizes the sources of order flow. This means that applications are more able to go and build their own order flow auctions rather than having to rely on somebody else, which is really cool. It's going to be a really like cool dynamic where in the past, everybody assumed that everything would go through a single auction, something like Suave or something like that, single global auction for all kinds of intents. Instead, you're going to have a more sort of like open ecosystem. And then lastly, underneath everything, you of course have token interfaces. So the two major ones that are interesting to think about there are 7281, which is XERC20, which provides an interface for burning and minting assets between chains, as well as a loose definition of how to like rate limit how tokens move between chains for security. And then more recently, 7802, which is a proposal from Optimism on like how you can create a unified interface for all of their like roll-up clusters. And then lastly, everyone is shipping. This is a really, really exciting time in chain abstraction. There have been like more announcements in the last 2 weeks than really anybody can keep track of, and it's honestly super cool to see. Particle is going live with their mainnet launch soon. I think Ethan will be talking about what they're doing and about Universal X, which is super interesting. Beyond that, you had Router protocol added support for the Bitcoin blockchain. So this is the first intent protocol that is actually supporting native Bitcoin, which is incredible. Also very, very well timed a couple of days ago. Biconomy introduced this concept of like more modular execution engines and is also coming out with an AI-based solver in the next couple of days ago, and then also soon. And then Socket and Near pushed out a new chain abstraction framework. Across and Uniswap did an integration for cross-chain swaps. So this is like the ultimate vision of Uniswap X. Sprinter was launched, which is a rebrand of Sigma, which is a previous kind of like interoperability protocol that is now focused on like intents. Greg is up here, who you should go and talk to him about it. One Balance introduced Token Teleport a couple of days ago. And then, of course, the Everclear mainnet beta, which happened around the last Abstract Summit. Things are snowballing, right? We are seeing chain abstraction become reality. This is really, really awesome to see. But we're not there yet. There's still a bunch of open questions that we have to solve in order for this ecosystem to actually work. And that's what I want to kind of focus the rest of this talk on, is to think about like how we can get involved in answering some of these deeper questions that at the moment are kind of being like hidden behind the curtain. Question number one, how do we solve for solver economics and decentralization? This was something that came up in the last panel. How do you keep solvers decentralized, and how do you make sure that they make money? So the secret answer to this is that solvers make money right now, but the whole system is just a house of cards. Like the reason that solvers make money is because intent protocols are heavily subsidizing are by like giving incentives in order for solvers to be able to go and fill transactions. They're giving rebates coming from chains in order for solvers to go and give transactions. Excuse me, sorry. This is obviously not a sustainable outcome. I don't want to recreate the like token, the like incentive farming, giant bubble that we just came out of. So in order to avoid that outcome, what we need to do is figure out how to actually make it so that solving is a competitive market. There's a few different like ways to do this, or at least there's a few different solutions that I think can kind of come together to enable this. This problem is really the biggest thing that we are focused on at Everclear. And a big part of our solution is to figure out how to like just minimize capital management and rebalancing overhead altogether, right? Allow for these solvers to collaborate with each other. So that way you have this ecosystem of players that are together ensuring that their economics make sense, rather than having everybody be completely competitive to race to the bottom, and then all of a sudden the only players that are able to financially support themselves are the largest scale market makers. You also have a couple of other really interesting things. So Nomial is a relatively newer project that is thinking about ways to allow for having inventory on each chain. And that way solvers can go and like borrow liquidity from pools. Now there are certain limitations around this. It's not just possible to have passive liquidity for solvers to borrow from. That kind of breaks the trust model of intents in the first place. But there are potentially ways to use pools of liquidity to improve the economics of solving. And this is a really interesting like active research direction. And then lastly, as I mentioned earlier, standardizing around solver infrastructure is a big one. The easier you make solving, the more people can get involved. Like ideally, the outcome, and this is the really, really cool thing about solving is like solving doesn't really have any like actually material trust and technical considerations. You don't have to be online in the same way that you do for like a staking network. Or you can solve from your phone. All you need is a device that is connected to the internet sometimes. And that's incredibly powerful. There's no compute requirements. There's nothing else that's actually really deeply involved. And so in theory, if you make the process of solving simple enough, anyone can do it. And I think that's when things get really interesting. Now, should anyone do it? I don't know. But there is an interesting argument to be made that when you make things easy enough, we can really massively expand out the solver ecosystem and also expand out the types of intents that can be filled. A second problem is account level fragmentation. So one thing that we've kind of done with a lot of the like account abstraction standards is like push some of this complexity upwards to where accounts sit. There are challenges right now with like EIPs 7715 and 7755 that lead to actually this incentive to create more accounts. So, you create accounts for this project, you create accounts for this project. They're all tied to different forms of like biometric 2FAs or whatever, but they're all separate accounts. And so what you've done is you no longer have liquidity fragmentation across chains, but now you have liquidity fragmentation in like 10 different wallets that you own, which is obviously also a very negative outcome, right? And then you have this like secondary problem around like 4337, which is that 4337 is an approach to account abstraction that allows for EOAs to behave like smart accounts, but and 7702 is kind of like an extension to that. But all of these things require deeper changes into the protocol and deeper changes to the way that we build things. Now, a potential solution here is work that was actually just announced by Biconomy called their Fusion module. I haven't looked too deeply into it, but I would recommend checking it out. Intent composability is another big open question. I see Kevin from Kalani up there. He's probably the best person to talk to about intent composability, maybe in the world right now. Intent composability basically means like how do you take different pieces of intents and put them together, right? How do you allow for one intent solver to bring liquidity, another intent solver to know how to get like routing data from a chain, like a DEX aggregator or from some other sort of like off-chain source of data, another intent solver that's access to be able to submit transactions to a certain chain, and put those things together to create a combined solution. Today, when you do intent composability, what that actually means is I do like an intent-based bridge transaction across chains, and then on the target chain, I swap on a DEX. But this actually isn't great. What you're doing there is composing on-chain. When you compose on-chain, it's actually kind of inefficient. Not only does it cost more in gas, but there's not as much predictability. There's this like hidden kind of problem here where I need to know the routing data from something like 1inch at the time of execution of the target chain transaction. How do I do that? Right? Ideally, that should be inserted into the target chain transaction in the first place and not something that I bring with me from the source chain all the way over to the target. Very, very interesting avenue of research that I think is honestly one of the most cool places to get involved in this space at this time. And then lastly, there's still like open questions around developer design patterns. I'm sort of seeing these two different like patterns emerge right now. One is this notion around orchestration. I see Dean smiling over there from Agoric. Orchestration is this notion that you can go and you can basically sort of similar to the way that like JavaScript stacks work. So you can like call stacks work. You can like define a recipe for a bunch of things that you want to do across a bunch of chains, put them all together and execute them all atomically, right? And so this allows you to create applications that can go and touch things that live on many chains at the same time. But there's a slightly different design pattern, which is like the kind of like across and like deposit from anywhere type of pattern, which is all of your stuff lives on one chain, you just make it accessible from anywhere. So there's this kind of like push and pull happening between two different models right now, and we don't really know yet which model is good for what kind of use case and what limitations exist. So if you're an app developer, this is a really great exploration to do because there's likely new kinds of use cases that you can build with chain abstraction, with things like orchestration that people don't really know about yet, simply because we don't know where these boundaries exist right now. And then there's a number of other kind of like smaller open questions, right? How do we account for the fact that different chains have different trust assumptions, right? If you're doing a chain abstracted transaction to Arbitrum or a chain abstracted transaction to some like long tail L3 that is using off-chain DA, that is using some like really like quite custodial mechanism because it's a game and they don't necessarily need to care as much about security. How do you differentiate between those two things from a chain abstracted perspective? What implications exist for the user for security? Should order flow auctions happen in wallets or in apps? So who should actually own the auction? Who should own the intent part of this puzzle? How can intent protocols expand to many chains, right? Where do we get permissionless expansion from? And then how exactly will AI affect solving? I think AI solvers are going to be probably the dominant type of solvers in the future, right? It makes sense. There's a lot of opportunities out there. There's a lot of optimization that can be done. AI is specifically very good at reading lots and lots of public data and then coming up with like an informed solution. But how will this actually affect what the solver ecosystem looks like? To wrap up, I think we are kind of in this like really interesting liminal space right now, where we had this hypothesis around chain abstraction that was this very, very like intangible vision. And now we have coalesced to creating an ecosystem of projects that have all doubled down on this vision and created products around it. And this ecosystem, which is honestly remarkable, is from the get-go quite interoperable, right? We have from the get-go designed this like architecture in a way where different pieces of the puzzle work together somewhat seamlessly. But we're not there yet. There are still no applications. And this is really the big thing that we need to do. In order for chain abstraction to succeed, we need to show that it works. We need to show in practice that this actually does happen, like things, that the abstracted experience looks the way that we say it does. And in order to do that, we need to start thinking about what kinds of metrics we want to look at in the future. And so I've put up a few metrics that I think are going to be worthwhile to look at the next time we do this kind of a State of the Union, hopefully in a year, maybe in a year and a half. Let's see what happens. But these are goals that I think I would like for this space to head towards, right? 1,000 abstracted applications. It seems like a big number, but I think it's actually quite possible, especially for heading into a bull. 500 intent solvers. I think there is a huge argument to be made, especially as we expand out to a ton of new chains, that there should be more and more solvers to exist to like target some of these like more niche verticals. 1,000 new chains. To be honest, that one I think is going to happen even regardless of whether or not we want it to. And then lastly, 50 million real users, right? Actual users, day-to-day, daily active users. I think this is actually something that this space can accomplish for the first time in literally over a decade. So my hope is looking at these can be a little bit of an inspiration, a little bit of a North Star for this ecosystem.